Good evening, everybody. Welcome again back to the Baku American Center Facebook page. Delighted to welcome everybody to another virtual American Center program. This evening, we are very fortunate to have with us the Regional Medical Officer Psychiatrist from the State Department in the European region, Dr. Stephen Young. Many of you will have attended Dr. Young's session at the Baku American Center a few months ago, speaking about bullying in schools. Today, he's going to be talking about an issue that is hugely material to our times, which is managing stress within the house, particularly under stressful conditions, such as the quarantine conditions we find ourselves. So let me, without any further ado, introduce Dr. Young. Everybody, Dr. Stephen Young, again, State Department psychiatrist from EUR. Dr. Young has been with the State Department in this capacity for many years, serving tours in London, Tokyo, Bogota, and Dakar, and is now based in Athens, covering all of Europe. And again, Dr. Young is going to talk about managing stress at the time of the coronavirus. Dr. Young.
Okay, so am I on? Okay, good. All right, so hi everybody. I hope a few of you do remember me from when we met at the Baku American Center. Obviously, the world has changed a lot just in that very short time, and we've been kind of scrambling to think about and talk about some of the mental health issues that have arisen and during this pandemic. So this is a talk I put together over the last couple of weeks, the last 3 weeks or so. And what I'm trying to do is to cover some material that may not be available online. There's a million websites now about sort of mental health issues and having a hobby and that sort of thing. But we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of family and kids and couples and how difficult that can be right now. What got me thinking about this was headlines like this. And again, is this really true? Are they really going to have more divorces in China? Who knows? But certainly there's been a lot of this kind of thing in the popular media, and really people have been asking about it. And plus, I can just see in our own population that and even in my own house that these things are really tough right now. Trying to manage these boundaries and and come up with some ideas to make it work better. I started out this talk was more about couples. What I got back from feedback was we want to hear about kids as well. So I've kind of adapted it to both, for couples without kids and couples with kids and everybody in between. Actually, there's probably things in this talk that everybody could sort of take home. But obviously having kids at home and having to work and be a teacher and be a guidance counselor and be an activities therapist is an extra level of stress for a lot of parents. Why does this matter? It matters because right now relationships are more important than ever, but the strain on relationships is greater than ever. So at the time when we kind of need each other the most is the time when we're all feeling very taxed ourselves and don't really have a lot for the other person sometimes. And it's especially hard when both feel that there's no gas in the tank. The other support systems that we rely on, for many of us, are harder to access. We're more isolated from our family, from our friends, the people that we would, go out with and for a run or for a beer or for a lunch to kind of, relax and vent a little bit. Those avenues are closed for many of us. So it puts even more pressure on, the people in our families to support us and for us to support them. And this issue of old cracks and underground pitfalls, it just means that, in a lot of relationships, there's always a backstory. There's always unresolved issues. There's always things couples sort of work on and struggle with over years. And those right now can sort of be more dangerous, and because of all the pressure on the relationship and the concerns about the future. So I think talking about this is really important. So I like to start this, why are we the meanest to the people we love the most? Because they let us. So this is a guy, this is just a store worker. In America, this would be a 7-Eleven I don't know what the version of that is in Baku, but I'm sure you have convenience stores. And, you know, generally you're not going to go into this guy and yell at him, right? Because he's gonna kick you out of his store. But you'll go home and yell at your spouse or your kids, or they'll yell at you. And you know, why is that? Well, it's because they'll let us, because the next day they'll still be there. And you know, ironically, this is really a luxury that we have family members who will kind of put up with us. But we often don't see it that way. And so you'll end up being nicer and more polite to a stranger than you would be to the person that you sort of decided to spend your life with. And I bring this point up just to kind of make people think about that and not abuse that luxury. Although it, you know, sometimes the only person to vent to is the people in your family, and that can be okay. But you know, with the knowledge that you know, it's not something you want to overuse. So I like this quote. I pulled this out of a Time article last month. I think it gets to some of what we're talking about today. Have you recently noticed how loud your partner chews? That her placement of items in the fridge is illogical? That his consumption of toilet paper, soap, the good snacks is remarkably high? That parenting might not be one of his or her core strengths? If so, you might be married during a pandemic. And I think what she's getting at, which I think we're all experiencing, is, you know, it's a lot more time together. And there's a lot of things in a marriage and a family that just sort of get decided without a big discussion. My favorite example is what side of the bed people sleep on. Often people sleep on the same side of the bed for years, but they never can remember having a conversation about, you know, sort of who picked what side. And one thing that in this current environment where families are spending a lot more time together is you're just more observant of all these different things that you might not be, you know, really think about that much. And now you kind of are thinking about it because it's sort of right in front of you. And so these little arguments and spats can pop up about things that really have probably been going on for a long time, but you just weren't as aware of them before. So hang on, sorry, went too fast there. So, you know, this whole issue of old wine and new bottles, I think, you know, what's really happening is a lot of the issues that couples are dealing with right now, they're not new. You know, you're the same people you were in January. But, you know, the stakes are a lot higher and things are more emotional, so it feels new. And some of the, you know, the conflict feels new or feels scary for that reason. And the stakes, you know, they are higher. Some of the things people are worrying about right now, you know, kids' education, what's happened for the rest of the school year. Most schools are closed, but some are coming back. But what about next year? What's school going to look like, you know, in September? What about kids who are going into a senior year of high school, for example? I mean, there's a lot of things that were sort of on autopilot as far as kids and schools were concerned that now all of a sudden are much more tenuous. You know, financial issues. Unfortunately, most everybody listening to this talk gets a paycheck, so that's great. But that doesn't mean we're not looking at our savings. We're not thinking about what happens in a year or 5 years. We're not wondering about, you know, the viability of our jobs, all those things that, you know, were not in the worry column in January suddenly kind of are. And then there's the more specific issues related to the epidemic. You know, what if one of us gets sick? What if one of your parents gets sick? I've already seen this scenario a few times with people who've got parents who get sick and they can't get to them, or even if they are local, they're not allowed to visit them in the hospital. I talked to an employee yesterday whose parent died of COVID. And so, you know, a lot, all of a sudden, again, a kind of a chronic worry about caring for parents who are older and far away now becomes a much bigger worry. And then, you know, this question of how cautious is too cautious. You know, do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Do you let anyone in your house? Do you let no one in your house? So, you know, all of these things that are things that we didn't really, you know, think about all that much a couple months ago. Now we're thinking about all the time. On the who's more cautious, this is just a Twitter post. This is a person who says, you know, I'm a travel writer. I'm advising everyone, you know, cancel everything. Don't travel. Don't be a spreader. But her husband refuses to cancel his mountain bike trip. And so this is something that, you know, couples didn't even think about, you know, 2 months ago, that now is a source of significant conflict in some families. You know, is your behavior, is your activity going to put me or the family at risk? And so, you know, kind of I know that this is certainly new wine. The old bottle is that you bring the, you know, your old coping mechanisms to this problem. And so the way that you problem solve in your relationship then, you know, transfers over to this kind of a problem. Who spends more? You know, money's an issue in many marriages and how it's handled. And again, sometimes a lot of the handling is unspoken. But now, you know, you're more aware of who's spending what, because they might be spending it right in front of you, or they might decide they need to buy 50 rolls of toilet paper like this guy. And there may be differences of opinion about that. You know, what's the best way to spend money, especially if you're worried about money in the future. So another area where conflict can arise. Whose fault is this? This is a slide I put in more for our, you know, embassy population, but, you know, often when things go bad overseas, the discussion comes up, whose idea was this in the first place? You know, who wanted to do this foreign service life? And we wouldn't even be in this mess if it wasn't for you. Now, ironically, the United States has, you know, as many or more cases than any place else in the world. So I guess this one is a bit moot. But still, I think when there's stressors on foreign service families, this issue of whose idea was it to be in the foreign service can quickly rise to the surface. This might be the most important slide of the talk, which is really trying to be patient. What expectations do we have for our family relationships? A lot of couples create more problems when they feel they should. You know, other people are doing better. We should be doing better. I thought we were better than this. The reality is all couples are going to struggle right now. This is a unique experience for really everyone, for people as individuals, for people as members of a couple, for people as parents, even as children, thinking of your own parents. So it's very hard to know what normal is and should be. You know, you're gonna have your rough patches. I mean, you know, I think that's normal. So being patient with yourself and each other is really important. A lot of other people are struggling too. So it's not just you. And, you know, I think if your world comes down to, you know, TV and Facebook, it looks like everyone's doing all these really creative, wonderful things, and their lives are almost better in a way. And many of us feel the opposite. Well, you're not alone if you feel the opposite. So try to be patient with yourselves. It's really important, and with each other, even if, you know, even if things aren't going terribly well at the moment. So I wanted to talk a little bit, what I call this old school psychiatry. I want to talk a little bit about just kind of kids and relationships in general. Again, I'm trying to find some stuff that you know, that's just not out there on the internet, that's sort of unique, that to get you to think about some of these issues in different ways. So I want to start talking about kids. I'm going to talk about two psychiatrists who were in the 60s. The first one is Bowlby, who talked about attachment theory. And his whole idea was that, you know, kids and parents attach to each other, and it's a natural event, and you don't have to be perfect. You kind of have to have three ingredients. You know, you have to care about them and be committed to them. You have to set limits, which of course is an issue right now, right, for many of us. And we have to facilitate development, which means giving them access to education and feeling a roof over their head and food in their stomachs. And basically, he felt that those three ingredients would provide an adequate attachment. Building on that, excuse me, it's morning for me here, so I'm still a little coughing. It's his colleague Winnicott came up with what he called the good enough parent. And I think that's a really good concept to think about right now. And so Winnicott took Bowlby's thinking a little further and said, look, many parenting skills are innate. You learn them from your own parents. And you don't have to hit a home run every day. Good enough is good enough. There isn't a parent alive who wouldn't take back a day or many days. There's some days you're just not going to do as well as you would hope. There's days you're going to strike out. But, you know, the great thing about parenting and kids is that, you know, the next day is the next day, and you get another chance. And both Bowlby and Winnicott thought that this idea that, you know, parents don't have to be perfect, And they're both parents and children were struggling with sort of an underlying unconscious conflict. The child is sort of accepting the realities of an imperfect world, right? When they're born, they think they're all powerful, they've never been unhappy, they've never been hungry. So all of a sudden they're in this world where suddenly they can be hungry or cold or wet. And that's a real struggle for kids. And on the parent side, their lives are changed when they have kids. They have to accept the lack of control that comes with having children. So both sides are sort of working on big issues. And so every day isn't going to be perfect. And I think right now where a lot of parents are really trying hard to do the right thing and worried that they're not doing enough, it's good to remember this idea of the good enough parent. So moving on to couples. This is a model that I've used for a long time in my practice. And I talk about 3 marriages. So the first one I call my big fat Greek wedding. And in this marriage, the couple has good access to each other, as you can see by the dark arrows, but the world has access to them too. And the world is kids and jobs and parents and other responsibilities. So this marriage can work, but it can be very chaotic because, when everybody's first in line, nobody's first in line. So there's a constant jostling and competition for attention. And so this is a marriage where you come down in the morning and there's some strange kid eating breakfast at your table. The phone's always ringing. Someone always has to go somewhere. Someone needs a ride somewhere. It's just very chaotic. And this can work, but it's kind of exhausting for the couple because they're constantly negotiating, all these many needs, both from each other but also from everyone else. And again, since there's no stratification, every request is equal, which makes it really difficult for everyone at times. So this marriage is sort of the opposite in a way. This I call the corporation. This is more marriage you would see sort of in the 50s and 60s, but certainly in the State Department too, where the couple has limited access to each other, but the world has full access. So this is a marriage where the dad works until 7 every night and plays golf Saturday and Sunday with his friends. And basically his world is work in his professional context. And that could be, of course, T-States could be the mom as well. But the other partner basically handles the household and the kids and schools and all those other things. And they're kind of separate. And they have a collegial relationship, but mostly their attention is focused on their individual lives and demands. This marriage can work and often does work. I think the 2 problems with this marriage is, one is that it can be prone to affairs, because this can be a lonely marriage. And also, this is a marriage that can really struggle when the kids move out, because the partner who's sort of focused on that really loses a big chunk of their their reason to be there. So again, these are marriages that can work, and they're sort of more traditional in a way, but they can have issues. So what I try to do is to get people to think about this marriage, which I call the sun. And in this marriage, both parties have full access to each other, but the rest of the world is second. And that includes kids, that includes work, that includes everything else. So the core of the relationship is the most important thing. So that's the sun. And everything else is a planet. These days, I'm sure many of you feel like the kids are the sun and the parents are one of the planets, and that certainly can be true. But I try to get people to push back into this model, because really everything stems from the couple. Often when I show this picture, I draw another circle around those 2 arrows in the middle to emphasize that really none of it really is going to work or make sense unless the couple's working together. Everything else is going to suffer if they don't, work together and support each other and care about each other. So, just a way to think about relationships, particularly at a time when our relationships are under strain, to think about, sort of where you might lie in that continuum. So, part of the reason I show those slides is because you notice, of course, there's boundaries all over the place in those slides, right? There's lines, there's dotted lines, there's solid lines. and there's arrows bridging boundaries, and that's because boundaries in every relationship are important. But right now they're even more important, and I think that's where a lot of families are struggling, is sort of boundaries in day-to-day life. So what do I mean by that? I mean that in regular normal life, there's a lot of boundaries that are just kind of set for us externally. School starts when it starts. It's a hard boundary. People have to be at the office when they have to be at the office. I mean, it's a hard boundary. What time dinner happens for a lot of families is a fairly hard boundary because it's built around work and school schedules. So there's a lot of boundaries that are sort of already in place that you never had to really think about. But now some of those boundaries have become much more fluid. So like, when does work start and end? Does work is it a 24-hour operation? When do you actually begin working? When do you stop working? Or do you stop working at all? Being somebody who's on call 24/7, like I am, it's always been a struggle. And for a lot of us in the department, it's a struggle as well. Where there's an expectation that you're sort of on the other end of an email 24 hours a day. But now even more so, right? Because if we're staying home, there's nobody really there to tell us when to start, more importantly, where to end. Who needs to be alone sometimes, and how is that created and not interpreted as a rejection? I think one of the key things that's come out in a lot of the discussions about what people are dealing with right now is that it's totally okay for people to have some alone time, and for the other partner not to feel that that's a rejection of them. Wanting to just read for an hour, or play a game for an hour, or take a walk, or whatever, by yourself is okay, and it doesn't mean that the relationship's in trouble. And wanting that doesn't mean the relationship's in trouble. Being forced to occupy the same space doesn't mean you have to be on top of each other all the time. So trying to create some space is perfectly okay. Invisible boundaries doesn't mean there's no boundaries. It just means you're not paying attention to them, or haven't taken the time to create them, or you're ignoring them. So I think it's really important that people find a new structure. If you're working from home, where, what room? The example I use is, I've been living in a 2-room hotel suite for the last several weeks. Well, if I take up one room with what I'm doing with one of my talks or something, that basically cuts my wife's space in half. So figuring out where you can work, where other people in the family, sort of have some space to move around, is important. How many hours are you going to work? Are you going to start at 8 and work until 4, or 8:30 and work until 6, or whatever your schedule is? But how do you shut off? A good way to structure that is to set times for meals. If dinner is at 6, it's at 6, and that's a way to kind of sort of help you plan your work time. How are kids' duties and schedules to be allotted? Again, kids especially like schedules and predictability. So the more you can plan, the better. Not to obsess about it, but the more that people can know sort of what to expect as the day goes on, the better they'll do. And of course, you'll fall, and many of you have been dealing with this already for a long time, and that you've already sort of fallen into a schedule, even if you didn't plan it. But being aware of that, I think, is a good thing, because people do better when they know what to expect in the day-to-day of their lives, even if the bigger picture that we're dealing with right now is chaotic. And I think that's especially true of kids. But inevitably, conflict is going to happen, argument's going to happen. And so this is just a good quote to sort of, keep in mind. Stress can trigger memories from the past, so sometimes we respond in the present as we did in the past. So asking your spouse a question and actually listening and processing before pulling the ripcord on an argument can have a positive impact. So that's sort of a long statement, but what it's really saying is try to stay in the here and now. Rather than make everything about everything, try to focus on what's happening in the moment. And it's really hard. It's hard because you get upset and you do start thinking about all the other times you've been upset, and even if you're not actively doing that, you just automatically do it. But you're gonna have a much better resolution if you can try and stay in the moment, if you can. So here we have this talk about helping marriages, and now I'm going to have a bunch of slides about fighting. It seems ironic, but you know, you're gonna have fights, you're gonna have arguments. So the question isn't so much, you know, how to avoid them. The question is how to do it in a way that's, you know, less destructive. The tensions are high. There's a lot to manage, and fights are going to happen. Some ground rules, as I just said previously, really important to try and stay in the here and now and try and avoid you always and you never statements. And it's very hard to do this. You just sort of reflexively do it. But you know, if you get called on it, then you try to back it down. You know, it's okay to walk away. I tell people all the time that the fight will be there tomorrow. If it's a big enough thing, it will be. And you know, so if someone walks away, if they need to regroup, it's better to do that than to sort of force them into a corner. I think that really leads to the next point, which is really important, is that people cope differently. My example here is one, but it's just one example. Some people want to watch CNN 24/7. Some people can only take small doses, but people cope differently in a lot of other ways too. So, you know, and also on any given day, you know, you may feel like you're doing well and your partner may not feel like they're doing well or vice versa. And sometimes you don't know that. And so somebody might be having a bad day, and then a fight kind of can erupt from that. But try to remember that, you know, just because you're doing something a certain way doesn't necessarily mean other people in your family are going to do it that way. You know, rules for fighting continued. Number 4 is sort of like number 1. Don't go global. What that really is about is, you know, don't make everything about everything. You know, so if you're arguing about, you know, whether you use, you know, too much salt in the food, stick to that, and don't turn it into a, well, you know, your parents never taught you how to cook or some other, you know, global statement. That's never going to work. One of my examples of this I use in another talk is when I sometimes try to find something in the refrigerator, I can't find it. I go to my wife and she finds it in 2 seconds, you know, sort of like a magician. And then she'll say, men can never find anything. And so that doesn't help the discussion because I'm immediately defensive and feel required to defend all men. Ironically, every time I use this example in a talk, some woman in the audience raises her hand and says, but it's true. It may be true, but going global, making it about everybody or everything, that generally is not going to help your argument to go well. Try not to make it personal or see feedback as a personal attack. Again, really, really hard. But, you know, when you start making personal criticisms in the service of whatever it is you're arguing about, it's not going to go well. You know, calling somebody a big jerk is never going to solve the problem. What about kids? You're in a small space, you're having an argument, the kids are there. What do? You know, I have mixed feelings about this because it's important for kids to see that adults can have conflict and can get to the other side of a conflict, and even if it's imperfect, you know, that people survive this. On the other hand, I don't want you to have a big knockdown drag out in front of the kids for 2 reasons. One is that it makes the kids feel uncertain, you know, about themselves and worried about, you know, or things, you know, do I have to worry about my parents splitting up on top of the COVID? The other reason is teenagers will hear the argument and then they will use parts of that argument against you in a future argument with them. So we don't want to give them ammunition. So I have a good example of this. It's a case a couple I worked with several years ago, and they had 1 child. And so the deal in the house was that on Saturday the mom got to sleep in, and or I'm sorry, Saturday dad got to sleep in, and Sunday mom got to sleep in, and the other weekend day that the parent would get up with the kid. So on this particular Saturday, the kid was on his computer all day long, and you know, he was playing games and watching videos and chatting with his friends. And so before mom went to bed on Saturday, she said, look, tomorrow no screens, you know, go practice your guitar, clean your room, you know, do something else, but you know, no screens tomorrow. So the next day starts okay, and he comes down and has breakfast with his dad and does the dishes, and he goes in and he straightens up his room and finally comes out and says to dad, you know, can I watch a cartoon? I'm not going to do anything else. I'm not going to play a game. I'm not going to send an email. I just want to watch a cartoon. So the dad said, okay. So mom comes down a few minutes later because it was her day to sleep in. And of course, what's the first thing she sees? Is the kid on the screen. And so she, erupts, and the parents have an argument about this. And I heard this story both from them and the kid separately. And so I said to the kid, well, what did you do when they started to argue? And he said, I turned up the volume. So in this scenario, of course, he wins. But what was interesting about the parents is when we talked about it, later on, the issue was that the dad felt it was unfair for the mom to set the limit on a Sunday because that was his day. And that's perfectly okay. But he should have talked to her about that Saturday night, and they should have worked that out rather than let it, erupt into an argument in front of the kids. So, if you feel like there's an issue that you're not comfortable with, talk to your spouse about it. I'd much rather have the parents a united front, even if it's, even if the limit isn't quite as hard as one of you would like, rather than letting the kids split you and undermine you like that. So I think it's okay to have some conflict in front of kids, but within limits. And again, maybe the most important thing of all is to give your partner the benefit of the doubt. They're the ones who are in there with you. They're the ones who've committed to you. And again, you're going to be nicer to the guy at 7-Eleven, but at the end of the day, try to remember that they're trying their best too. And it's especially hard when you're both having a bad day, to remember that. This is my last slide on rules for fighting, I promise. But these are sort of just two big things to avoid. One is unilateral decision making, and that's when one of you sort of just decides, I'm going to do something. The problem with that is that then the other partner says, well, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to do this, and it sort of just builds from there. One example relating to COVID I saw on this front was a couple who didn't really agree about comfort with a home delivery of food. And so one partner was hungry and wanted to call for delivery. The other partner didn't want a stranger coming to the house. So they sort of had a small argument about this and thought it was resolved. But a half an hour later, the other spouse just went ahead and ordered the food anyway. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that you have to have a discussion about who's going to order hamburgers. But I think big decisions involving money, decisions involving kids, those are things you really want to try and talk about, and not just make a unilateral decision, because invariably there's going to be issues, and your partner is going to resent it. And then the other thing to avoid is I talk to couples a lot about is hopelessness, and almost always they'll say, well, we're not hopeless, but some of the things people say do imply hopelessness. So hopelessness is when you say, I'm not going to bring this up because I already know what they're going to say. So you've already kind of given up. You're not going to even give them a chance. And, that's a slippery slope, because once you start deciding, that they're not worth talking to because you already know what they're going to say, they're, of course, going to think the same thing about you. You got to try and give them a chance. Give them a chance, give yourself a chance, give the marriage a chance, to get back in there and take another swing. And it's hard. It's very hard to do that. And this position is sort of a safe position, right? Well, why, I don't want to stir things up. Well, that's true. Sometimes having a talk does stir things up, but ultimately, whatever you're concerned about is going to go better if the two of you have kind of talked about it, versus if one of you sort of decides, well, I knew she was going to say no, so I just did it anyway. That is not going to have a good outcome. Some other important strategies. Take your own pulse. Know when you need a timeout. You know yourself. You know yourself better than anyone. If you're feeling, angry and irrational yourself, it's okay to take a step back. This is the classic scenario where the other partner says, don't walk away from me, or don't walk out of here, whatever. And, that honestly, when the person is taking a time out, it usually means that they're at that point, that's when you say things that you can't take back. So try to know yourself well enough to know when you need to, go read a book, or go play a game, or go, if you have the access, if you're lucky enough to have access to exercise, but to take some time for yourself. to do things that soothe you. Try to explain things when, I think when we get scared or we get frustrated or we get angry, we tend to just order people, hey, wash your hands. I think everybody does a little bit better with some kind of an explanation, especially teenagers, to say, hey, remember we all decided we were going to wash our hands every time we came in the house, versus ordering people around. Again, talked about this earlier in the talk, but space is super important. And it's hard to come by because you're in each other's space. But even in a small space, you can sort of hopefully, create some even psychological space, whether it's reading a book or emailing with friends or something which is sort of your time or your space. Try to have fun. These are serious times. We've got a lot on our minds. But even the kinds of things you're watching, you probably don't know either of these examples, but a movie like Tommy Boy, which is a complete waste of time, but it's funny and it has nothing to do with anything disastrous, versus Ozark, which is all about subterfuge and murder and backstabbing. So try to spend some time on non-Ozark activities. This is in some ways, the silver lining here is that we're getting to spend more time with family members. There are a lot of things about them we like, even though we have to remind ourselves of that at times. But try to have some fun with it. Acknowledge and accept the different coping styles. I think that's really important. I think that's hard for me. Sort of I think about, there's a way to do things and everybody doesn't do it that way is sort of the wrong way. But the reality is there's lots of ways to do things. And accepting your different coping styles, I think, is really an important part of this. And even with kids, it's important because they are going to cope differently, both based on their own personality, but also their age. So, a younger kid is going to, have a much different kind of experience than a 17-year-old. I think one thing to remember about kids is on this age thing is that I'm finding that the kids who are kind of having the most trouble are kind of in the 8 to 13 range. I think kids younger than that, little kids, don't really kind of understand what's going on, and they're gonna take their parents' word for it that things are going to be okay. And I think kids older than that, are beginning to develop some resiliency in some context. Not perfect, but sort of better. But I think that 8 to 13 group, they are old enough to have a cognitive understanding of what's happening, but they're emotionally not really developed enough yet to handle it. So I'm seeing a lot of kids in that range who are kind of having more tantrums, acting out more, pushing back more. And so just that's a group we want to kind of be more sensitive to, that those kind of middle school kids who are, sort of don't really have a lot of resiliency yet for difficult times, but, have enough cognitive ability to understand that we are in a difficult time. So think about them. I think kids in general, the normal response for kids who are stressed is going to be to regress. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So two of the big issues with kids, how to talk to them about what's happening. Again, age appropriate is the way to go here. With little kids, I don't think you have to get very specific, and we certainly want to reassure them that things are going to be okay. There's going to be another side of this. Little kids, that absolutely their yardstick for how scared should I be is how upset the parents are. So we really want to try and reassure them. The other issue is not letting them drive you and each other crazy. And this comes back to the boundaries. It's been funny, but I think also sort of poignant that you've seen all these, messages on Facebook about how people have a new appreciation for teachers, because they're around these kids all day. And a lot of parents are learning having a kid around all day and managing them all day is a lot of work. They're needy, they're emotional, they get bored easily. And so I think, trying to have schedules for them is really important, but also giving yourself a break. If they're watching a little bit more TV, if they're playing video games more, I think that's okay right now. You don't want them on on Minecraft for 8 hours in a row. But if the family rule is, an hour on the weekends for Minecraft and none during the week, I think it's okay to let them have some time during the week right now. You don't want them to drive you crazy or each other crazy. And a little bit of flexibility might go a long way. When you talk to them, I think, first of all, don't be afraid to talk about it. A lot of parents are. Of course, the message to the kid then is that this is sort of too scary to even be discussed. Take your cues from them. If they're not asking questions, if they're okay with whatever the version is, then I think that's good enough. Don't feel like you have to sort of push them. Again, dealing with your own anxiety is really important. They're going to sense if you're anxious and afraid and upset, and so you want to try to control that. I'm not advocating lying to them, but I am advocating, not having a full emotional breakdown in front of them. And a really important thing is to focus on what's good. There's a lot of smart people working on this. The reality is there is going to be another side to this thing. It's not going to go on forever. And I think that's a great thing to be able to say to kids. There's scientists all over the world working day and night right now to find solutions to this problem. And so I think, that, some optimism, not false optimism, but I think that's true is a good thing. And kids can hang on to that. And again, if you have a little bit of hope, they're going to pick up on that. And, that's going to give them a little bit of hope too. Another thing I think with kids that's important is making them part of, kind of your solution. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, again, plan, right? We want to have a schedule, some kind of schedule for them, but we want to be flexible enough that if they need some downtime or if they're having a meltdown, we want to be flexible for that. As I said, their default response often is going to be to regress. So kids who are walking are going to start crawling. Kids who are toilet trained are going to start having accidents. Older kids are going to get more babyish. And so you're going to see that. It's normal. They're going to catch back up, but it's their way of kind of telling you that they're not doing as well. I had a mom talking to me about a kid this week, and this kid says things like, "I'm getting angry right now." And, my take on that was what she's really saying is, I'm getting ready to lose control. She didn't really understand the word angry the way an adult understands it. But she knows that when she starts to lose it, that's not good. And so, my advice to the parent was hear it that way. Hear it as her saying, I'm getting ready to lose it, and respond in that way. What needs to happen to help her feel calmer, to help her manage that strong emotion. Accept that you're good enough. Remember Winnicott. You may not feel good enough, but you usually are. And again, it's okay for them to see you frustrated and angry. It's just, it's getting to the other side of the frustration and anger that's important. And again, try and enjoy some of the time with them you would not normally get. Take shifts. I mean, and I'm sure you all are doing this already, but if both parents are working and there's no other help, then you're going to have to figure out a way for, for one to work while the other one supervises kids. And again, plan, right? That's something you can schedule. I'm going to do mornings, you're going to do afternoons, whatever it is, but much better to plan and talk about it rather than to sort of think it's going to happen on its own, because invariably that's going to be an argument and lead to unilateral decision-making and various other things. Despite everything, you're not the only two people left on Earth. Those people who supported you, they're still out there. Yes, grandparents, don't know how to use Facebook Messenger, and there's some tech education that has to happen. But your family, your friends, your colleagues, they're out there. It's not quite the same on a computer screen, but try not to sort of drill down into a hole and feel like, well, I don't want to do that. And that's what kids do, right? Kids say, I'm bored. You come up with 10 suggestions. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. The reason they do it and we do it is because we're grieving the thing we can't do, the thing we want to do. But that doesn't mean these other things are useless. I also just want to make a quick empathy statement to the stay-at-home spouse, whoever that is, if there is one. The working spouse still has the structure of work to fall back on. It may not be the same, but they're still answering emails, they're still getting calls, they still have duties. The stay-at-home spouse might have had most of their life in the community, involved with people and friends and projects and various things in the community that now have all gone away. So try to be empathic to that person, and certainly don't think that person's job is to do everything. Essentially, you don't have anything going on, so you can do all the dishes and you can do all the child care and you can do all the cleaning. Don't go down that road. And lastly, on despite everything, I would say, don't take on the big issues. This isn't the time to say, why didn't we ever have another kid, or some long unresolved issue in the background of the marriage. It's you're both stretched thin, you're both sort of overwhelmed right now. It's just not the time to take on those big things. You may be tempted now and again, but try and pull back from the brink. Not going to be helpful. And then the color of the slide didn't come through very well, but the most important thing to remember is that distress and feeling a bit overwhelmed is normal right now. It's a normal response to change. It's a situation that's abnormal, not you. Feeling overwhelmed is not mental illness. And hopefully thinking about some of these things in this talk will help. My my email address is on the slide. People email me all the time about things, and that's fine. And I think we're going to have some time also for questions. I think you have a text box there, and you can type in questions. What I've been doing with these is sort of giving people a couple of minutes, to type before I sign off. So certainly, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, I won't say your name. I will read the comment and then just respond to it, but I won't say who it's from.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Young. That was typically fantastic. This is the third talk of yours I've attended, and each time I'm extremely impressed. In fact, I was asking myself questions and writing them down throughout the presentation, and then in the next slide you would answer the question I had. So the comprehensiveness is really unparalleled. I also wanted to, initially I was going to say we'd like to thank your wife for not only giving up all of her husband, but half of her living space. But I have to admit, I'm quite wounded by that men can't find anything comment. So, whatever. Just kidding. I have a few questions myself. I'm sorry?
It's been verified by many women at my talks.
Yeah, whatever. Just kidding. Of course, I can't find anything. And I would say, as the going into why didn't we have another kid, I just from personal experience can say that is not something we've asked ourselves in this period. In fact, it's almost been, never mind, I don't want my son to see this someday. But anyway, I have a few questions, but we do have some from the audience that we could get into, and I could even, I don't know if you can see them, but Sabina.
I'm kind of looking now. Hang on a second. Let's see. Some of these are just sort of comments back and forth.
I can see one that Sabina says more a comment, but it leads into a question. She writes, but you get frustrated when your plans stay as plans and you don't achieve as much as you want to in the day. That is certainly something a lot of us struggle with. Where does the time go?
Yeah, again, and I think this goes back to kind of a bit of the mixed message of the talk, right? Because it's planning and trying to schedule, but then also accepting the fact that, right, it's going to be imperfect because it's a replacement for the schedule you had before. So it's not going to be the same almost by definition. And I think accepting that, it kind of comes back in a way to the whole good enough parent thing. Accepting the fact that every day is not going to be a perfect day. Good enough is good enough, and so I think sort of applying that principle in other areas is not such a bad idea. But it's frustrating. I mean, even today, setting this talk up, this is a new platform for me. We couldn't get the slides exactly the way we wanted them. We had to play with it for a few minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And I think that's a good example of, and for me, that's not because I like things, with my talks a certain way. I'm very picky, and yet, I've had to sort of accept the fact that, this is what we have right now. Better to do our best, better to be good enough than to not do it at all because it's not exactly how I would want it. So I'm very empathic to that that statement in question, and I think it's something we're all struggling with. There's a couple other questions. Somebody asked, what advice can you provide to numerous family gatherings on the occasions of the Eid holiday, which is normally celebrated with days of family visits and communal dinners? Yeah, really tough question. It's funny, I don't know if anybody's playing Animal Crossing. This is something we're doing. It's an online game that Nintendo brilliantly brought out in March, but it's a way that you can sort of meet with people. And there's a guy on this who's actually created a virtual Eid celebration and invites people to it, and has had so many people interested that he has a waiting list. So I know that need is out there. I think it's really tough. What we know about the virus is that big groups of people close together is your highest risk. So like weddings, funerals, and unfortunately big family get-togethers that happen at Eid. I think a couple of things you can do is one is figure out who your circle of comfort is. Everybody has some people that they're sort of around right now, so you're going to include them. Can you do some of it virtually? If you're really going to do it, can you do it outside? Because outside is certainly better than inside. But it's really tough because you could have a large group of people and have someone spreading the virus who doesn't even know they have it. So I think that's a very tough thing right now. These family get-togethers. I just had a colleague whose mother died in March, and they had a funeral, and they only allowed 10 people to go. And so they had his wife and 2 kids already were 4 of the people. So very, very hard, these family gatherings that are so important to people, but they're also, higher risk because lots of people in a close space inside is the sort of the highest risk activity you can almost do. So if you're going to get people together, try and start with the people you trust, try and put some of them on screens, and try and do some of it outside would be my best advice. But as God's everywhere. He's not just in a building. He's not just in one room or one living room. And so, our connection to our faith is really important, but that connection can happen anywhere. Another question, any suggestions for kids' behavioral issues without the distraction of school to entertain a bit? Yeah, I think this is really hard because kids are having more behavioral issues for the reasons I've stated, because kids, they're regressing, so they're acting younger, so that's a problem. They have you right there to manipulate, and kids manipulate their parents. They just do. They don't do it willfully. They just do it because they're humans. And they're around you a lot more than they normally would be. From school age on, I mean, the majority of kids' lives is really spent away from their parents, or at least a big chunk of their day is. So now they're there. I think so. How to deal with the behavioral issues? First of all, go back to the parenting skills you used when they were younger. If you used timeouts for certain behavior before, go back to it. I think being empathic to kids, though, is important too. To say, I know you're frustrated. We're frustrated. Everybody's frustrated right now. I have parents who are doing things like setting up strategies for kids when they're frustrated, like let's go do Legos, or let's do an activity that calms you down, whatever that happens to be. Again, the Minecrafters are all going to want to Minecraft, and they can't Minecraft all day long. But I think it does require some creativity. But the balance here is being empathic. Part of the reason they're acting out is because they're upset and afraid and disrupted, just like you are. Part of it is because they want what they want, and kids manipulate parents. Part of it is because they're regressing, and so they're they're sort of acting like younger kids because that's what kids do when they get stressed. And so trying a multi-pronged approach from your part, which is being empathic, but continuing to set limits and being a little flexible, letting them do some things that maybe you wouldn't normally let them do. But recognizing that, now you've got a lot more time with them to cover. And if some of that time is spent doing, whether it's a game, whether it's whatever it is, something that might not really happen on a school day usually, I think that's okay. I think you want to make clear that when life goes back to normal, the old rules are going to apply. But right now people are just doing the best they can to get through the time.
That's great. Well, we're delighted to take any more questions, so please write them down. But in the interim, I would ask, and this self-soothing idea is quite interesting, and that probably could be the subject of an entire other presentation, but it segues into something I've been asked about and asking other people about, was what is the proper role for alcohol in these situations? I was reading that a psychiatrist out of Harvard actually had advocated that all liquor sales be discontinued in the United States. It seems like it's potentially a crutch, but also a slippery slope. What are your feelings there?
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, I mean, the parts of life that can go on as normal, we should want to go on as normal, right? And so, having a glass of wine with dinner is something that can still happen. And so, depriving yourself of that, I don't. Well, I'm getting there. I don't see, any utility to that. This isn't something that is going to increase our risk of catching the virus. At the same time, though, right? I mean, we're certainly hearing from people who are, finding that they're drinking more and starting to drink earlier, and partly because they're bored, partly because they're stressed, partly because they think they'll sleep better. All of those things. I think moderation in everything. Everyone knows themselves. You know what your pattern was before. My best advice is to try and stay with your pattern from before. That getting into a new pattern where you're finding you're drinking, an extra glass of wine, an extra couple of beers, probably is something you want to pull back from. But I certainly think, if part of your winding down at the end of the day was to come home and have a drink and talk to your spouse about your day, that there's absolutely no reason not to do that. I think if you're finding, I didn't used to drink, 2 drinks after dinner, and I'm starting to do that, then I might pull back from that behavior a little bit. So my best advice would be to compare what you're doing now to what you did before, and how big a difference is it. But I think this idea of complete prohibition from alcohol is ridiculous. It's a central part of culture for many families and couples, and for some not at all. But the yardstick really is kind of what you were like before. If you feel a real difference between then and now, then yeah, I think that's something that you want to sort of look at and think about. But I think, the idea that you say, I had a really stressful day and I'm going to have a drink, and, we could argue about if that's the best way to self-soothe, but if it's your best way, then I'm fine with it. I think, self-soothing is an interesting concept because it's something we really try and teach kids. Kids at a certain age, at 2 to 4, we want them to be able to play independently and not need the parent for every second of the day. Work on self-soothing skills when they're upset, when they're frustrated, and it really comes right into adulthood, right? And we have things that we do that help us calm down and self-soothe. And for many of us, alcohol is one of those things. I just think, it's the sharpest knife in the kitchen. It's the one you want to use because it works the best, but it's the one you can cut yourself with. So you just want to use it carefully.
Excellent, thank you. I see we have another question in the. Actually, we have 2 new questions. Oh, they're coming fast and furious now.
All right, and I'm going to actually have to stop here in a couple minutes, but let's see what we got here. As challenging as online homeschooling has been, has provided some focus and structure for the kids' day. Now we're approaching summer vacation. Great question. I'm concerned we'll be facing another big change and fewer activities to fill the days. Really, really good question. So there's tons of stuff out there online right now about helping kids and managing kids and activities for kids. I think it might really even be worth paying for if there's a structured activity, whether they call it camp, whether they call it, reading skills, whatever it is. But because you're right, you're going to need something to fill that time. And now one nice thing is some of the posts are allowing more movement outside of the, letting kids go outside and things like that. But still, it's going to be a long day without the virtual school. I agree with that. And I think being proactive about coming up with a plan, whether that's jigsaw puzzles in the morning and something else in the afternoon, or some kind of online structured activity that you might even have to pay for, might be worth it. Because yeah, I think that's a really good question, and something I actually need to research myself to better advise parents about. Because you're right. I know some families are going to travel in the summer, because that's beginning to open up. But I know some families either can't do that or are afraid to do that, concerned about going back to the States and being quarantined for 2 weeks. So 2 more weeks in a closed space without even the kids' regular toys and games and stuff. So I think a really good question, and one that I need to look at myself a little bit more. Yeah, how to keep good relation with kids while keeping them learning at home. Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? A parent's role is really different than a teacher's role, right? And teachers can do stuff that parents can't, and kids act differently towards teachers than they do parents. One of my big questions I always ask parents with kid behavior is, what's the kid like in school? And if the kid is different in school than they are at home, then I know the kid is making choices about his behavior. So, like, if you have Down syndrome, you have Down syndrome everywhere. You don't just have it, you have it at home, you have it at school. But if the kid's having tantrums at home and never has one at school, that tells me that, something is different in that environment. So what happens when home and school are the same environment? I think it's probably hard for kids to figure out to shift gears like that. So you're the nice parent who reads to them at bedtime, but you're the teacher parent during the day who, gets on them for not doing their homework. I have a kid, I just heard about him, I'm going to see tomorrow, who has been going into his room saying he has school the last month, hasn't logged into school at all in the month of May. He's just been in there doing other stuff. So I think it's tough. I think one thing you can do is try to explain it to the kids and say, look, for right now during the school day, I want you to think of me as my teacher. Now, they're gonna act out anyway because they know who you are. But I think for you, that can help to say, look, my role right now is to work on your education. That's what we're doing. We're not doing this other stuff. You can say things like, your teacher wouldn't allow you to do that, would they? And things like that. Again, I think middle school kids are the hard ones here, these 8 to 13s. Little kids are going to see it as a game. School's not as hard. Older kids are going to be more independent. It's these middle school kids, these 8 to 12s that, are going to need more supervision, that are sort of a little bit more overwhelmed anyway. They're old enough that they have homework. I think they're the ones that are going to be hardest. But in your own mind, I think that the first step is to be cognizant of your own role and make it clear that you're in a different role with them during the day than you are at night when you're putting them to bed. And that's a tough act to pull off. I don't deny, but I think that's really your only choice. I think if you act like a parent all day, that's going to potentially cause you problems. And I think sort of trying to shift into, hey, we're talking about school. I want you to think of me as your teacher. This is what we're doing. This is why you need to do it. And being pretty firm about it. And then, shifting more towards a parent role, as they move into after school, bedtime time is probably the way to go.
Excellent. Well, lots more questions I have, but I know that you've run out of time. So I'll just say that we really appreciate, once again, you're getting up early and sharing some of the latest thinking on how to handle these unnatural, these stressful situations in close quarters. So Dr. Young, thank you very much again. And thanks to everybody who joined us this evening here. And we have lots more coming on the Baku American Center Facebook page. Tomorrow we continue our entrepreneurship series with an event at 6 o'clock with preeminent local entrepreneur Fareed Ismailzadeh, founder of Golden Pay and Saab.az. So please join us then. But for now, join me virtually in thanking Dr. Young. Thank you, Doctor.
Bye, guys.
Bye then.